Since prehistoric times, human evolution is signposted by many milestones in history, from the first humans that created fire to those that picked up spears and made stone axes to elevate themselves above all else. If we've learnt one thing from those ancient ones, is that we all must evolve to better ourselves in this world. As a humble PowerApps developer, so must you evolve so you can reach further and build bigger and more complex applications as your experience grows. Just like those prehistoric humans who picked up tools for the first time, a milestone in your PowerApps evolution will be when you start building applications that use enterprise-level storage solutions like Microsoft SQL. Let's take our first steps into a bigger world. On the screen right now is my company or my organization's Azure Portal. As you can see, we have a whole ton of services that we can spin up and run in Microsoft Azure. What we're concerned about in today's video and what we're going to be highlighting in today's video is the ability to create SQL servers and spin up SQL servers really quickly in Microsoft Azure. So let's just go ahead and do that. And that way we can get into our Power App and I can show you a bit more on how to connect Power Apps into Microsoft Azure and then build an application around a relational database versus using a flat database source like a SharePoint list. Let me click on Add Database. I'm using the free trial. I use an existing resource group that I've created already. My database name will be ChinoDB. And I'm going to create a new database server to host this on, and it's going to be called Chino DB SRV. And the full server name will be chinodbsrv.database.windows.net. My server admin login will be Chino admin, and my password will be for me to know, and I'm going to click OK. I'm going to take everything else as default and click Create. Okay, that's the deployment of those two resources complete. Let's go take a look at what we have here. So in our SQL database section, we can see our database. So if I go home and I click all resources, I can see both of those resources there, which is the server and the database that's created underneath the server. So let's go to the server first. What you have to set up here is the firewall. Now, there's a couple of settings here we need to do to make sure that this works properly. One, we need to allow Azure services and resources to access this server. We need to make sure that that is set to yes. That will ensure that services like PowerApps and Power Automate can connect to our database. Now, the one last thing that I need to do is I need to create a rule for my particular desktop. And why I need to do that is because I'm going to be using an application called SQL Management Studio to connect to the database so I can configure it. I can configure things like tables and procedures and that. Basically build our database for our application. And the simple way to do that here is just to add my client IP to the firewall rules, and that will add my IP at the moment to the firewall rules here, which will allow my desktop to connect to it. Click Save. Now we can go in and configure other things like resources, the size of the database, how big the database will grow, and how many service cycles we want to set to our particular database. How much we want our server to use, like from a cloud resources point of view. I'm not going to go into that today because I really don't want to deep dive too much into Azure because it is a huge subject, and I'll probably spend half an hour just going through, at least half an hour just going through just touching on some of the basics of this platform. I think for today's example, I'm going to show you just the bare minimums that we need to get this up and running, and it's really going to be up to you guys to explore that further. But things like setting up these different parameters will obviously also affect the costing and the pricing of your server setup, and will affect how much credit your server setup will chew through. So obviously these kind of things will probably need to be tuned a little bit, especially if you're just sort of trialing this out. You don't really want your server to be using up a ton of resources, because that'll just cost you a whole heap of more money. But again, not going into that today. That's really all we're going to need to get our database, to connect to our database and to configure it in SQL Management Studio. So I'm going to leave a link to SQL Management Studio in the comments below. Again, I'm not going to show you how to install that either, because it's a really straightforward application. Just download it and install it, and meet me back here at the video in the next step. You should be looking at something very similar to what I'm looking at here. This is a connect to server screen, and it's expecting our logon details so it can connect to our database and allow us to proceed or continue on further with our installation. So the first thing we're going to need is the server name, and if I go back to our Azure screen, I go home. If I bring up, go home, and I click on our server, we can see our details here. So our server name is listed conveniently on this screen. So let me click on copy to clipboard. Go back to SQL Management Studio and paste that. Our server admin that we configured when we created our server I configured it, was Chino admin, and I'll type my password in and I'll click connect. Like I said, in this particular example, we're going to go for a two-table structure, which is really about as simple as a relationship can get. And I thought for today, I am going to create two tables. One table that will store the details of what I have in my stock, and it'll just be a simple list of items that I keep on hand in my stock levels, or in my on my stock shelves. And it'll also contain things like how many items I have of each particular stock item. Now the second table will be a order form. So once stock levels reach a certain level, so say I've got I keep a whole heap of diodes on hand, and when my diodes reach, say, when I reach a level of, say, I've got 10 diodes left in stock, I want to create a new order record that will generate an order to my supplier, who will then restock my warehouse. So let's create our first table. And this table will be used to actually store our items in our warehouse or our inventory. So the first thing we need, and we will typically do this for every single SQL table that we create, we want to create a primary key which which will be an identifier for each particular record and will be unique for each particular record. Now, if you work with SharePoint, you know that each SharePoint list item, for example, gets an ID field, and we can do the same thing for SQL. In fact, we really need to do the same thing for each one of our SQL tables to maintain that primary key and that identifier for each particular record. So I'm going to make that an integer, and I'm just going to call it ID. We never want it to be null, but we really don't need to worry about that because this will be automatically incremented by the database server. We don't need to set this value. This will always be unique and will be set automatically when we create a new record. To ensure that happens, we need to right click on that field and click Set Primary Key. And then if we highlight that and we scroll down, here we've got a parameter here, or a property here called identity specification. We expand that, highlight that. We just want to change that to yes. Now this is set as the identity and will automatically increment each time we create a new record. What else do we want to store about our inventory item? Well, we want to store a name. And we'll just make that a varchar, which is effectively a string. We want to set a description. Again, we'll make that a varchar. And let's make a field called stock level. And this is going to be an int. Oh. And I think for this example, we'll just keep it at that. Click on save. I'm going to call this table stock. All right, if we just click refresh on that. See, we've got our table, our stock table. Now we want to create another table here to store our orders in. Now, just like with the stock table, we need a primary key. We want to set that as the identifier. Now in here, what we want to store here, because we are storing our orders of stock, we want to actually create a pointer to which stock item we're creating an order for. So because we have created a identifier in our stock table, all we need to store here is the stock ID of that particular stock item. And we know that was an integer. And let's store order date. And that's a date and time field. Let's maybe amount. And let's just put in the description of the order. All right, let's click save and let's call that orders. So now with those two tables created, the other great thing that we can do in SQL Management Studio is that we can run SQL scripts directly onto our table. So I'm going to run a particular script that's going to create some dummy records for us so we can see a little bit more of how this works in PowerApps. So it'll make it easier to see things in PowerApps. So under our stock table, let's go down and let's select our stock table and click on new query. And in here, I'm just going to run this insert into SQL query that will generate these three particular records. And it's just going to create some existing stock for us in that table, like I said, to make it easier to demo this in PowerApps for you. So let's click on execute. That's generated 3 rows in our SQL database, and we can even go right click and go select the top 1,000 rows, and it'll show us that we've got those 3 records now stored in that table. Let's do the same for orders. Select orders, new query. Let's just paste this particular query in the query window, and this is just going to generate a few orders for us against our order table. Alright, so we've created 4 orders. If we just do a right click on that and select the top 1,000 rows, we'll see that those orders have been created. Terrific. Alright, we've got our dummy data populated in our database now. The next stage will be going to PowerApps and actually connecting to our database and taking a look at what this actually looks like and how this is, how we access data, SQL data in our PowerApp application. Okay, got PowerApps open. Let's just create a new Canvas app and let's call this order stock orders. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of a demo here, let's create a connector, and I'll select the SQL connector. I'm going to add a connection. The connection type will be SQL Server Authenticated. And our server name, that's our server name address, Chino DB serve. Our database was ChinoDB. Now, username will be dbuser1. Just type my password in here. Now, so let me explain quickly. Off camera, I actually went in and created a SQL user just for the ChinoDB database. Now, why I've done that is probably not really even necessary for this particular demo. I could have used the Chino admin username password that I created when I set this server and database up in the first place, and that would have worked fine. Why I did this was in sort of more of a real world scenario, you would have a separate user. If you were using SQL Server Authentication, you will most likely create a separate user to connect to that database, and that, you know, that's really around thinking about security and segregating security across different databases on a database server. Not the most securest if you're using the same username and password across all your databases on your server, and that's, you know, ultimately in the end that's not really realistic either. So off camera, I did create this user, and I've done that off camera because I really don't want this video to become, you know, more of a SQL tutorial. SQL is a whole other massive subject, and there's just a huge amount to cover, even to go over the basics with SQL. So it's something moving forward, if you are going to be using SQL with your application and as a sort of database backend for your PowerApps applications, you know, you're really either going to have to start getting your head around how to use SQL and how to sort of set SQL up and the ins and outs of it. Either that, or you work alongside a SQL administrator. And, you know, a lot of the time when you're developing apps in a real world scenario, as a software developer, you would actually be working with a SQL admin, and you wouldn't necessarily have access directly to a SQL server from an administrative point of view. So yeah, so in the real world, this would be more likely what would happen. You would be, as a software developer, you would be provided with a username and password to connect to a database, and you would connect and you'd get all the resources, access to the resources that you require for for your specific application. So with that out of the way, let's continue. Okay, I can see my two tables there now that I've created. I'm just going to add both of those. Click connect. And you can see now in our application, we've got these two SQL connections, one to orders and one to stock, which I guess is great, but let's see the problem that we've got here now that we've connected directly to the SQL database from our Power App. If I hit insert in gallery and I'll just say connect to our orders, let's add some fields. So you're already seeing a bit of an issue we have here. I won't even bother adding any more fields to this. You can see that I can see the description and I can see our stock ID, but we're not bringing in any information about our stock ID. We're connecting directly to the table that is storing our orders. So this really isn't the correct way to connect to our SQL database. What we need to do is create a stored procedure on our database server that will join our two tables together, produce an output, and then read that into our Power App. So let's go ahead and do that. And stored procedures. Just need to create a new stored proc. The way we do that is right click, new stored procedure. So we're selecting stock name, stock description, amount, description, and order date from orders and from the stock table. Now the way we're doing that, we're doing a join on those two tables on our stock ID. So we're taking two different tables and we're creating a procedure that, well, this procedure effectively joins both of those tables into one flat table so we can easily read it in our Microsoft Power App. Now, if we just quickly look through here, where some of these fields we're referring to as T2 and some of them we're referring to them as T1. Now the T1 columns, the T1 columns are coming from this from orders because we've got this alias here, T1, after our table name. And we've done the same here with stock. We've just put a T2 after here, which gives us this pointer or alias to the stock table. So we know T2 stock is coming from stock table, T2 stock description is coming from the stock table as well, and all the T1s are coming from the orders table. Now, the other thing you can do here in when you're selecting from SQL, you can return the field, even though the name of the column is amount. I can go T1 amount as ordered amount, and this will just make it easier to read and easier to identify in our table. It'll already have a sort of a heading that will make sense. Now, like I said, I really didn't want to get too deep into the SQL side of things in this tutorial. We're really covering Power Apps and how we connect Power Apps to SQL here. But some of this stuff we have to touch on. This will be a this kind of thing where we're joining more than multiple tables together will be the basis of a lot of your stored procs when you are connecting to SQL. So let's execute that, which saves our stored procedure to the server. And we right click on our get orders. So get orders was what we called our stored proc up here under the create procedure get orders. And if we execute, click OK. we see our output from our stored proc is, and like I said, it's one flat table of data. We got our stock name, stock description, but we also have our ordered amounts, ordered descriptions, and ordered dates. The next stage after this is how do we get this data into PowerApps directly. Now we, unfortunately, if I'll just swap back to PowerApps. Now, unfortunately, we can't connect directly to stored procedures, and not exactly sure why we can't do that through PowerApps. But as of this moment, we can't connect directly to stored procs. But connecting to stored procs is really the key to using SQL with PowerApps and to getting useful information out of SQL into our Power App application. So what we do use to do that is Power Automate. And if we go into our Power Automate, let me just delete that. And I've got a new Power Automate here, and it's triggered by PowerApps because we want to trigger this automate. We want to trigger this flow through our Power application. And the next step will be, if I just do a quick search and I scroll down here, looking for the SQL actions, and we've got an action here, execute stored procedure. So that's the one we want. Enter a custom item. Now our database name is ChinoDB, and our stored proc is getOrders. I'll click save on that at this point, and then what I want to do is I want to run a test, and I'll perform the trigger action, and I want to run the flow. So that's our output from our flow. If we click on that action, we can see our results set, and this is the format that we're getting our records back in. Big JSON object, very similar to what you'd expect from a web service, and that's the key here. So what we want to do at this point is we want to highlight all of that and just hit Control-C. Now, if we go back into our application and edit that, we want to do a new step. So in our body, we want to select the body that's come back from our previous statement, which is the execute stored procedure. So we select body there. And in the response body JSON schema, we want to paste Control-V what we had. Click save. Let's do a quick test on that. Seem to have got a success. And if we hit the response, we can see our output looks all good. And we can see our data packet there. So now that's done, let's go back to PowerApps. And in here, let's insert a gallery. Just blank gallery. We won't connect it to any data just yet. Let me move this down a little bit and maybe just put a border on it so we can see it clearly. I'm also going to insert an icon here, just a refresh icon. And on here, the action on that button, I'm going to call Power Automate. Now, Power Automate we want to call is getOrders. Now in here, I want to wrap that around. SQL order data. So I'm just setting a variable to the output of our stored proc, or the output from our Power Automate, which is the output from our stored proc. Now, in our gallery, the items of our gallery are going to be our SQL order data dot our results set and our table 1 data. Now if I insert a label, actually, even before I do that, let's run it for the first time so we can see some data in there. So we probably want our stock name first. And insert another label. Our order description. And our ordered amount. Probably ordered date would make sense as well. So if we insert a date picker, probably set that property as display mode. We just want to set that to view. And the default date is this item ordered date. I can add some headings here as well. I think that's probably enough covered in this video. You know, that's probably more than enough to digest at this stage. In the next, you know, we'll definitely have a part 2, and in that video I'll take this app a little bit further, and we can have a separate screen where we update our records, and then we're refreshing that data back on our dashboard. So we're sort of getting closer to building a complete application. But you know, what we've covered today is really the core functionality, or the core aspects of actually using SQL and PowerApps together to build your application. Hey, hit the like button if you liked this video, comment something in the comments section below, and of course subscribe to stay up to date with all my latest videos. I thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.